How a lost world became the beginning of England. The sea was silent until the dragons came. Carved from oak and fury, the Viking longships sliced through the dawn mist, their prows shaped like beasts of legend. On the holy island of Lindisfarne, bells tolled for prayer, not for warning. Then, on June 8, 793, the sky cracked open. Ravens circled overhead as Norsemen stormed the shore, their blades gleaming with the death of an age. Monks who had spent their lives illuminating words of God now faced the fire of the north. And in that single morning of blood and ruin, England as we know it was born. This wasn't just a raid, it was the beginning of the Viking Age. For the next 300 years these sea wolves would terrorize Europe, but they were more than savage raiders. They were explorers who reached America, traders who connected continents, and warriors whose tactics revolutionized medieval warfare. The attack on Lindisfarne announced that a new force had awakened in the north. Stones that once echoed with the measured tread of Roman legions now stood silent, their gates swinging empty in the wind that swept across Britain's abandoned frontiers. For centuries of imperial rule crumbled like poorly mortared walls as the eagles withdrew, leaving behind a land suddenly naked before its enemies. In villa courtyards where Latin poetry once filled evening air, weeds pushed through cracked mosaics, while painted gods stared down at gathering darkness. Britain's final Roman governor, Constantine III, had stripped the island bare of troops for his doomed bid for purple in Gaul. His defeat sealed what political necessity had already decreed. The legions would not return. Behind them they left a civilization built on Roman bones, but filled with native blood. A hybrid society that had forgotten how to defend itself without professional soldiers standing watch on distant walls. Local strongmen seized what power they could grasp. In hill forts that predated Caesar's conquest, British lords gathered their retainers and proclaimed themselves kings of territories that shifted like sand with each season's campaigns. Vortigern emerged as the most successful of these self-made rulers, his name meaning High King in the Old Tongue, though his authority extended little beyond the Thames Valley and the lands his sword could reach. Beyond Hadrian's wall the Picts sensed weakness, like wolves scenting blood. These painted warriors had tested Roman steel for generations, learning patience through bitter defeats, waiting for their moment to reclaim the rich lands that lay beyond their mountain strongholds. They came first in small raids, a burned villa here, a slaughtered family there, testing the response, measuring the resistance they would face. Irish raiders struck from the western seas, their leather boats carrying warriors who knew no mercy for the soft people of the villas. They called themselves Scoti, and their hunger for slaves and gold drove them deep into territories that Roman arms had protected for centuries. Along the western coasts, smoke rose from burning settlements as the sea wolves fed their appetite for plunder. From the Saxon shores across the North Sea came the greatest threat, and paradoxically what Vortigern believed would be his salvation. These Germanic peoples had watched Rome's decline with interest sharper than any blade. In their timber halls beside cold waters, warriors listened to tales brought back by traders and raiders, stories of a rich land protected by walls, but defended by men who had grown soft in their prosperity. The Saxon homelands offered little comfort to ambitious warriors. Between the Elbe and the Weser, in the lands that would one day be called Old Saxony, young men looked across storm-tossed waters and dreamed of better prospects. Their fathers had served as foederati in Roman armies, mercenaries who fought for gold rather than glory, learning Roman ways of war while keeping Saxon hearts. Now their sons saw opportunity where their fathers had seen only employment. Angles dwelling in the peninsula called Angeln faced the same hunger for expansion. Their territory, squeezed between Danes and Jutes, could barely support the warriors their proud bloodlines produced. Across the waters lay Britain, fertile, rich, and apparently defenseless. The stories grew more tempting with each telling. Fields that stretched to the horizon, cattle fat as seals, silver hoarded in villa strongrooms waiting for bold hands to claim it. Jutes from the storm-lashed peninsula north of the Angles added their voices to the growing chorus of interest in British affairs. These sea wolves had raided Roman coasts for generations, but now they heard whispers of something better than mere plunder. Land grants, permanent settlements, the chance to carve kingdoms from foreign soil rather than merely fill their ships with loot. Vortigern's invitation to these fierce peoples would echo through centuries like a bell-tolling doom. Faced with Pictish raids that grew bolder by the season, and Irish attacks that threatened to carve permanent footholds in his territory, he chose the path that seemed most practical. Hire Saxon warriors to fight Germanic wars. Use barbarian steel to protect British civilization. Such arrangements had precedent in Roman practice. Hengist and Horsa, two Saxon brothers whose names meant stallion and horse, would lead a war band to Britain in exchange for land grants in Kent. Their warriors would serve as foederati just as their fathers had served Rome, fighting against the Picts while receiving regular payments and the right to settle in assigned territories. It was an old Roman solution to an eternal problem. Let barbarians fight barbarians while civilized men counted the cost. Hengist proved as cunning as his namesake was swift. A warrior in his prime, scarred by battles against Frisian rivals and Danish raiders, he understood that this invitation offered more than mere mercenary service. Where Roman commanders had hired Saxon bands for specific campaigns, Vortigern was offering permanent settlement, a foothold that could become a foundation for something far greater than either party initially envisioned. 3 ships carved with dragon heads rode the spring tides toward the white cliffs of Britain. In their holds, alongside weapons and armor, the Saxon peoples carried seeds for crops that would grow in foreign soil, tools for building halls that would shelter Saxon children, and dreams that stretched far beyond their original compact with the British king. Women came too, though in smaller numbers, wives for the war leaders, daughters who would bind Saxon blood to British earth. Thanet received the first Saxon settlement, an island in the mouth of the Thames that offered both security and strategic position. Here Hengist established his hall, a timber building that followed Saxon patterns but used British materials, creating something neither fully Germanic nor entirely foreign. His spearmen built smaller dwellings around their lord's hall, creating a community that would serve as a model for thousands of settlements to come. This bargain worked at first. Saxon spears turned back Pictish raiders with a ferocity that surprised both friend and foe. These Germanic fighters fought with a personal intensity that Roman-trained troops had rarely matched, each man bound to his war leader by oaths that death alone could break. Their success against the Picts convinced Vortigern that his strategy was sound. Let the barbarians bleed for British prosperity. Hengist's ambitions grew with his understanding of native weakness. Through careful observation and frequent contact with local Britons, he learned that the High King's authority was far more limited than it initially appeared. The ruler commanded personal loyalty in his own territories, but beyond them his word carried little weight. Local lords ruled as they pleased. Roman cities governed themselves through declining councils, and vast territories answered to no authority more substantial than local custom. Messages began flowing across the North Sea to Germanic territories. Hengist's reports painted these lands as ripe for conquest, rich in resources, divided in governance, defended by men who preferred negotiation to battle. The response came in waves of long ships that rode the summer tides, each carrying fighters eager for land and loot, women ready to make homes in foreign soil, children who would grow up calling these territories their ancestral homeland. Germanic settlements sprouted along the eastern coasts like flowers after rain. In East Anglia, Angle fighters established communities that would give their name to an entire region. Essex, Sussex, and Middlesex marked the territories where tribal spears carved out kingdoms from Romano-British estates. Each settlement followed the same pattern: a war band claiming land in the name of their chief, building halls that declared their presence, establishing farms that would feed their children. Such transformations went deeper than mere settlement. In their homeland forests, these Germanic peoples had lived in timber halls, surrounded by smaller buildings that housed extended families, servants, and craftsmen. This pattern reproduced itself across eastern territories, creating communities that functioned according to tribal law and custom while occupying Romano-British land. Villa courtyards became farmyards, mosaic floors disappeared under rushes, and hypercaust heating gave way to central hearths that warmed halls filled with Germanic voices. Not all encounters between native and newcomer ended in blood. Many Romano-British landowners faced with Germanic neighbors who controlled the military balance chose accommodation over confrontation. Marriage alliances bound tribal war leaders to local estates, creating hybrid families that bridged two cultures while belonging fully to neither. These unions produced children who would grow up speaking both tongues, understanding both traditions, serving as bridges across the cultural divide that widened with each passing season. Vortigern's realization that he had invited conquest rather than merely employment came too late for effective response. By the time Germanic intentions became clear, Hengist commanded enough spearmen to defend his gains while his kinsmen continued arriving from across the sea. The High King found himself facing not hired soldiers but permanent neighbors who grew stronger with each ship that crossed the waters. Breaking point came when he attempted to limit Germanic expansion beyond their original grants. Hengist's response demonstrated how thoroughly the balance of power had shifted. He would take what his followers needed with or without native permission. The massacre at the peace conference, where Germanic Saxons cut down local nobles who came expecting negotiation, announced that the age of accommodation had ended and the time of conquest had begun. Battle followed battle as Germanic ambitions clashed with native resistance. At Aylesford, Horsa fell beneath local spears, but his death only strengthened tribal resolve to claim permanent holdings in these lands. Crayford saw Hengist's followers break Romano-British resistance so thoroughly that Kent became effectively Germanic territory. Its local elite fled or dead, its lands divided among tribal settlers according to their own customs and laws. Cerdic landed on the southern coast with ships full of West Germanic fighters, his eyes fixed on the rich territories beyond the South Downs. His campaigns carved a bloody path inland, establishing settlements that would become the foundation of what the invaders called Wessex, the kingdom of the Western Germanic peoples. Each victory brought more land under tribal control. Each settlement created another foothold for expansion. Ella established his kingdom in what had been some of the island's richest territory. his spearmen occupying villa estates and Roman towns with the confidence of permanent conquerors. The siege of Anderida saw Romano-British civilization meet its bloodiest end as tribal weapons extinguished a community that had survived 4 centuries of Roman rule in a single afternoon of slaughter. Germanic expansion followed the river valleys that provided both transportation and fertile soil. Along the Thames, tribal settlements pushed westward past London's crumbling walls. The Severn Valley attracted Angle fighters who saw in its broad waters an echo of their homeland streams. Northern routes led ambitious war bands toward territories that would become Mercia and Northumbria, each river serving as both highway and boundary marker in the gradual conquest of these lands. Cultural transformation accompanied territorial conquest. Germanic law replaced Roman legal traditions in occupied territories, with compensation payments taking the place of imperial justice. Vergild, the price of a man's life measured in silver and cattle, became the standard for resolving disputes that Roman courts had once decided. Spearmen sat in judgment over matters that had once been settled by educated officials, applying customs learned in distant forests to problems that arose in conquered cities. Tribal artisans began producing objects that blended Germanic traditions with Roman materials. Brooches, cast in classical bronze, displayed purely tribal decorative patterns. Weapons forged from Roman steel followed Germanic designs that emphasized function over ornamentation. Pottery shaped on Roman wheels carried decorations that would have been recognized in any Germanic hall from the Elbe to the Thames. Ancient gods found new homes in foreign soil. Woden's ravens watched over battlefields where Roman eagles had once led legions to victory. Thuna's hammer blessed fighters who fought for land that Jupiter had once protected. Sacred groves replaced Roman temples, while stone altars designed for classical sacrifice supported Germanic rituals that honored deities whose names had never been carved in Latin marble. Women played crucial roles in this cultural transformation. Germanic wives brought with them not only domestic skills, but also the responsibility for maintaining tribal traditions in foreign settings. Their looms produced cloth that followed patterns learned in childhood. Their songs preserved stories of heroic deeds performed in distant homelands. Their children learned customs that would bind them to Germanic identity, despite being born on local soil. Marriage customs changed as tribal traditions took root. Bride price replaced Roman dowry arrangements, with Germanic fighters offering weapons and jewelry rather than legal documents and property deeds. Wedding ceremonies moved from Roman administrative offices to timber halls, where tribal rituals sealed unions according to customs that predated Caesar's conquest by centuries. Burial practices mark the most visible sign of cultural change. Roman cremation gave way to Germanic inhumation, with fighters buried alongside their weapons. Women interred with their jewelry and tools. Children accompanied by toys that would comfort them in the afterlife. Cemeteries that had once held Roman urns now contained Germanic grave goods that proclaimed the identity and status of their owners. Language shifted as Germanic tongues grew dominant in conquered territories. Latin continued as the language of writing and formal ceremony, but daily conversation increasingly followed tribal patterns. Place names acquired Germanic endings that displaced Roman designations, while rivers and hills received names that reflected tribal perceptions of the landscape rather than classical geographical traditions. By the century's end, Eastern territories had become irreversibly Germanic. Where Roman villas had once housed educated gentlemen who quoted Virgil and debated philosophy, Tribal halls now sheltered fighters who boasted of cattle raids and composed verses about swordplay. The transformation was complete enough that visitors from Gaul would have found more familiar customs among the unconquered inhabitants of Wales and Cornwall than among the Germanic settlers, who now called themselves the rightful owners of territories their grandfathers had known only through raiders' tales. Such conquest created something new rather than merely destroying something old. This emerging synthesis was neither purely Germanic nor simply Roman territory under new management, but a unique creation that would develop its own character over the coming centuries. The seeds of future kingdoms lay in these earlier settlements, while the cultural mixing that began with conquest would eventually produce traditions that belonged fully to neither Germanic homeland nor Roman past. Ships continued crossing from the tribal territories, but now they carried colonists rather than conquerors, families seeking land among kinsmen rather than fighters pursuing glory in foreign battles. The Great Migration was entering its second phase, transforming from military adventure into permanent settlement, from raiding expedition into the foundation of nations that would endure for centuries to come. 7 kingdoms emerged from the chaos of conquest, like islands rising from a turbulent sea where once Saxon warbands had carved temporary holdings from British soil. Now permanent realms took shape with defined borders, ruling dynasties, and the ambitions that would drive centuries of warfare. Each ruler claimed descent from Woden himself, transforming raiding chieftains into kings whose bloodlines supposedly stretched back to the gods. Kent stood first among these nascent powers, Hengist's legacy grown into a kingdom that controlled the crucial crossing between the continent and Britain. Ethelbert inherited more than land from his forefathers. He commanded the ports through which trade flowed, the halls where continental diplomats gathered, and the warriors who had proven their worth against both Picts and rival Saxon bands. His realm possessed advantages that gold alone could not purchase. Northumbria sprawled across the northern territories like a giant awakening from slumber. Born from the merger of Bernicia and Dara, this kingdom stretched from the Humber to the Forth, encompassing lands that had once marked the frontier between Roman civilization and Pictish savagery. Ida the Flamebearer had established his stronghold at Bamberg, perched on coastal cliffs that commanded both sea approaches and the Great North Road. In the Western Midlands, Mercia gathered strength under rulers whose names would echo through the ages. Creota founded the dynasty that would challenge all rivals for supremacy over the Anglo-Saxon world, establishing his capital at Tamworth, where Roman roads converged and fertile river valleys promised prosperity. His descendants inherited not just territory, but the strategic position that could control trade between north and south, east and west. Wessex claimed the rich downlands of the south, where Cherdic's heirs built upon foundations laid in blood and maintained through constant warfare against British holdouts in the western hills. Winchester rose as their seat of power, a town that commanded the approaches to both the Thames Valley and the harbors, where ships from Gaul brought wine, silk, and the luxuries that marked a court's sophistication. East Anglia emerged as the realm of the Woffingers, rulers who traced their lineage to the wolf god himself. Their kingdom controlled the estuaries where rivers met the sea, the fertile flatlands that produced grain for export, and the trade routes that connected continental merchants with inland markets. Rendlesham served as their center of power, a whole complex that rivaled any palace on the continent. Essex and Sussex completed the Heptarchy, smaller kingdoms that nonetheless commanded crucial territories and strategic positions. Essex controlled the Thames approaches to London, while Sussex held the South Downs and the harbours that faced directly toward Frankish Gaul. Each maintained its independence through careful diplomacy and the constant readiness to fight for survival. These 7 realms shared common origins, but developed distinct characters shaped by geography, neighbors, and the personalities of their rulers. Kent, closest to the continent, adopted Frankish fashions and diplomatic practices that marked it as the most sophisticated of the Anglo-Saxon courts. Northumbria, facing both Picts and Scots, bred a warrior culture that valued battlefield prowess above all other virtues. Mercia, surrounded by rivals on all sides, produced kings who mastered the arts of alliance and betrayal with equal skill. Wessex, pressed by unconquered Britons in Cornwall and Devon, maintained the fighting edge that conquest required. East Anglia, protected by marshes and waterways, developed a merchant culture that brought wealth flowing into royal treasuries. Noble bloodlines claimed divine ancestry with the solemnity of gospel truth. Every ruler could recite the names that connected him to Woden through heroic ancestors whose deeds lived on in court poetry. These genealogies served purposes beyond mere vanity. They established legitimacy, justified territorial claims, and bound warriors to their lords through bonds that transcended mere military service. Ida claimed descent through Yngwi from the war god himself, a lineage that his sons and grandsons wielded like weapons in their struggles for supremacy over northern Britain. When Northumbrian lords met rivals in battle or conference, they carried with them the authority of heaven itself, the knowledge that divine blood flowed in their veins and divine favor blessed their enterprises. The Woffingas of East Anglia traced their lineage through equally impressive ancestors, their genealogy a catalogue of heroes whose names resonated in halls throughout the Germanic world. Woffer himself had been more than mortal man, a figure whose deeds merged history with legend, whose blood carried both human ambition and supernatural power. Mercian leaders descended from Isel, whose own ancestry stretched back through Offa of England to the gods themselves. This bloodline would produce rulers whose names became synonymous with power. Pender, the last pagan. Offa, the lawgiver. Lords whose ambitions would reshape the Anglo-Saxon world and whose achievements would outlive their kingdoms. Warfare between these realms began almost as soon as their borders solidified. Solon of Wessex struck northward into British-held territories, his victory at Durham opening the Severn Valley to Saxon expansion and cutting the last land connection between the Britons of Wales and those of the southwest. The battle marked more than military triumph. It represented the final stage in the Germanic conquest of southern Britain. Ethelbert of Kent faced different challenges as Tsaulin's power grew. The Kentish lord had inherited a realm that prided itself on sophistication and continental connections. But sophistication meant little when West Saxon warriors threatened his borders. The struggle between Kent and Wessex became a contest between different visions of leadership. Kentish diplomacy against West Saxon aggression, continental refinement against native ferocity. Northumbrian expansion proceeded along multiple axes as ambitious leaders sought to expand their inheritance in every direction that promised profit. Edwin seized control of Elmet, the last British kingdom in what is now Yorkshire, adding its fertile valleys to his growing realm. His ambitions extended beyond mere territory. He envisioned a domain that would stretch from sea to sea, encompassing both the ancient Roman province and the lands beyond Hadrian's Wall. Religious practices bound these societies together even as political rivalries tore them apart. Germanic gods received worship in timber temples that followed patterns established in the continental homelands. Woden's ravens watched over battlefields where kings sought his favor through offerings of blood and bronze. Thuna's hammer blessed marriages, harvests, and the forging of weapons that would carry Germanic ambitions into new territories. Sacred groves dotted the landscape like islands of holiness in a sea of secular concerns. Ancient oaks that had sheltered British druids now witnessed Germanic rituals, their branches heavy with offerings left by warriors who sought divine blessing for their enterprises. These trees became focal points for communities scattered across the countryside, places where law was spoken, justice dispensed, and the connection between earth and heaven maintained. Burial practices revealed the values that shaped these emerging societies. Lords went to their graves surrounded by treasures that proclaimed their status. Golden jewelry worked by master craftsmen, weapons that bore the marks of legendary smiths, vessels filled with mead for the journey to Valhalla. The ship burial at Sutton who would represent the pinnacle of such practices. A great funeral that transformed death into a statement of power. Marriage alliances wove complex webs of obligation and opportunity across the heptarchy. Daughters of rulers became instruments of diplomacy, their marriages sealing treaties, ending wars, and creating the bonds that might prevent future conflicts. These unions produced children whose mixed bloodlines carried claims to multiple thrones, setting the stage for succession disputes that would reshape the political map. Bertha of Kent traveled to Canterbury as the Christian bride of a pagan lord, her marriage to Ethelbert representing more than personal union. She brought with her a chaplain, a portable altar, and the hope that Germanic England might find its way back to the faith that Rome had planted, but political chaos had largely destroyed. Her influence would prove more lasting than any military conquest. Trade networks spread like veins through the Anglo-Saxon world, carrying goods, ideas, and influences that bound the kingdoms together, even as their rulers schemed against each other. Kentish merchants established trading posts that stretched from the Rhine to the Thames. Their success measured not just in gold, but in the connections that made their territory indispensable to continental commerce. Frankish coins circulated in Anglo-Saxon markets, their golden faces carrying images and inscriptions that spoke of a wider world beyond the heptarch's borders. Wine from Gaul graced the tables of Germanic lords, while amber from the Baltic found its way to English courts. These trade goods represented more than luxury. They marked the integration of Germanic Britain into the European economy. Craft production flourished under princely patronage as leaders competed to display their wealth and sophistication. Master jewelers created pieces that rivaled anything produced on the continent, their work combining traditional Germanic motifs with techniques learned from Roman precedents. Weaponsmiths forged blades that became treasured heirlooms, passed from father to son, and from lord to faithful retainer. The great halls that crowned centers of power became showcases for this artistic achievement. Tapestries worked in silk and gold thread depicted the deeds of ancient heroes, while carved columns supported roofs that soared higher than any structure built in Britain since Roman times. These buildings served purposes beyond mere shelter. They projected power, created spaces for the rituals that bound society together, and provided settings for the poetry that preserved cultural memory. Poets held positions of honor in every court, their voices carrying the responsibility for maintaining the connections between present and past. Through their songs, the deeds of Hengist and Horsa lived on in halls that had never known their presence, while the genealogies that justified authority received the polish that transformed mere lists of names into epic narratives. These bards served as more than entertainers. They functioned as historians, legal experts, and diplomatic messengers whose words could make or break the reputations of lords. A poet's favor meant that a ruler's deeds would be remembered with honor, while their displeasure could condemn even great achievements to obscurity. The relationship between warrior and wordsmith became one of the defining characteristics of Anglo-Saxon court culture. Legal traditions developed that reflected both Germanic heritage and the practical needs of settled societies. Compensation payments replaced blood feuds as the preferred method for resolving disputes, creating a system where every injury had its price and every wrong could be made right through proper payment. Rulers became the guarantors of this system, their courts the places where custom became law. Ethelbert of Kent issued the first written laws in the Anglo-Saxon world, a collection of legal precedents that transformed oral tradition into documentary authority. These laws dealt with practical matters: the price of a stolen horse, compensation for various injuries, the procedures for resolving property disputes, but their significance extended far beyond their immediate purpose. They marked the beginning of a legal tradition that would influence English law for centuries to come. The concept of wergild, man price, became central to Anglo-Saxon justice. Every free man had his value set by law, a sum that must be paid to his family if he was killed. Lesser amounts for injuries that fell short of death. This system recognized social distinctions while providing peaceful alternatives to the cycle of revenge that had characterized earlier Germanic society. Territorial expansion remained a constant preoccupation of ambitious rulers. Wessex pushed westward into Devon and Cornwall, its kings determined to complete the conquest of southwestern Britain. These campaigns combined the practical goals of acquiring new lands with the symbolic importance of finishing what their ancestors had begun. Each victory added to royal prestige while providing new territories to grant to faithful followers. Northumbrian rulers cast their eyes beyond Hadrian's Wall, where Pictish kingdoms offered both threat and opportunity. The warfare that resulted was fierce and frequent, as Germanic spearmen tested themselves against opponents whose warrior traditions stretched back to the days when Roman legions had feared to venture into the highlands. These northern campaigns produced heroes whose names would echo in poetry for generations. By the century's end, the Heptarchy had established patterns of rivalry, alliance, and cultural exchange that would shape Anglo-Saxon England for generations to come. 7 kingdoms had emerged from the chaos of conquest, each developing its own character while remaining bound to its neighbors through ties of blood, trade, and shared heritage. The stage was set for the struggles that would eventually reduce 7 kingdoms to 1. Creating the England that would face new challenges from across the sea. Canterbury's bells rang out across Kent like harbingers of transformation, their bronze voices announcing the arrival of Augustine and his 40 companions on the shores of Thanet. Behind these, Roman missionaries stretched a journey of faith and fear, months of travel through hostile territories, nights spent wondering if they carried the word of God to their deaths, days when only papal command prevented them from turning back to the safety of Rome's familiar streets. Ethelbert received the black-robed strangers with the curiosity of a ruler who had already glimpsed Christianity through his Frankish wife, Bertha. Her private chapel in Canterbury had served as a fragile foothold for the faith, a single candle flame in the darkness of pagan England. Now Augustine's mission promised to kindle that flame into a blaze that would consume the old gods and remake the spiritual landscape of the Saxon kingdoms. The Kentish lord's conversion began the greatest transformation in Anglo-Saxon history. Where his grandfather had worshipped Woden in sacred groves, Ethelbert now knelt before altars dedicated to Christ. His royal example opening floodgates that would wash away centuries of Germanic paganism. Christmas Day in the year 597 saw thousands of his subjects baptized in Canterbury's rivers, their emergence from the waters marking rebirth for individuals and the kingdom alike. Augustine established his archiepiscopal see in Canterbury, transforming Ethelbert's capital into the spiritual heart of English Christianity. Stone churches rose where timber temples had stood, their Roman architecture speaking of permanence and divine authority that temporary structures could never convey. The mission brought more than faith. It carried literacy, learning, and connections to a wider Christian world that stretched from Ireland to Jerusalem. Paulinus carried the gospel northward to Edwin's court at York, his tall figure and gaunt face marking him as a man consumed by holy purpose. The Northumbrian ruler faced a decision that would echo through generations. Abandon the gods who had blessed his victories for a deity whose power remained unproven in battle. His hesitation reflected not cowardice, but wisdom, for kings who chose wrongly in matters of divine favor often found their thrones swept away by rivals blessed with better judgment. Edwin's council met in solemn session to debate this momentous choice. Warriors who had followed the old ways since childhood listened as Paulinus spoke of eternal salvation and divine judgment. The debate that followed would become legendary, crystallized in the words of an unnamed counselor whose metaphor captured the human condition with startling clarity. "O King, the present life of men on earth," the advisor declared, "seems to me like the swift flight of a sparrow through the hall where you sit at dinner on a winter's day. Inside there is a fire to warm the room, but outside the winter storms rage. The sparrow flies quickly through one door and out another. For the few moments it is inside, it is safe from the winter storm, but after a brief moment of comfort, it vanishes from sight into the wintry world from which it came. So this life of man appears but for a moment. What follows or what went before we do not know." These words struck Edwin's heart like an arrow finding its mark. If Christianity could illuminate the darkness that surrounded life's brief flight, if Christ could offer certainty about what lay beyond death's door, then perhaps the risk of abandoning ancestral gods was worth taking. On Easter Sunday 627, Edwin descended into York's baptismal waters, carrying with him the allegiance of Northumbria's warriors and the hopes of missionaries throughout the Saxon lands. Conversions spread like fire through dry timber, each royal baptism igniting the faith of thousands who followed their leaders' spiritual choices. In Essex, King Sabrat welcomed Miletus to London, establishing St. Paul's Cathedral as a beacon of Christianity in the Thames Valley. East Anglia received the gospel through Felix of Burgundy, whose mission transformed the kingdom of the Wafingus from a bastion of Germanic paganism into a stronghold of the new faith. Monasteries began sprouting across the converted kingdoms like flowers after spring rain. Lindisfarne rose on its tidal island, a beacon of Celtic Christianity that would illuminate northern England for centuries. Jarrow welcomed Benedict Biscop's Roman-trained community, its scriptorium destined to produce manuscripts that would preserve learning through the dark centuries ahead. Whitby emerged as a double monastery, where Abbess Hilda would guide both monks and nuns in the pursuit of holiness and scholarship. These religious houses served purposes that extended far beyond prayer and contemplation. In their scriptoriums, monks labored over manuscripts that preserved not just Christian texts, but classical learning that might otherwise have vanished forever. Their libraries became repositories of knowledge that drew scholars from across Europe, while their schools educated the clerks and administrators that emerging kingdoms desperately needed. Aidan arrived at Lindisfarne carrying the austere traditions of Irish monasticism, his mission blessed by the powerful monastery of Iona, where Roman missionaries brought organizational skill and political connections. Celtic monks offered passionate spirituality and artistic vision that would transform English Christianity. The meeting of these two traditions created tensions that would ultimately require resolution at the highest levels. The Synod of Whitby in 664 marked the decisive moment when English Christianity chose between competing visions of the faith. Oswio of Northumbria presided over debates that seemed to concern arcane matters of calendar calculation and monastic tonsure, but actually determined whether English Christianity would align itself with Rome or Celtic tradition. The stakes extended beyond mere ritual. They encompassed authority, orthodoxy, and England's place in the broader Christian world. Colman spoke for the Celtic party with the eloquence of a man defending not just practice but identity. His monks followed traditions established by Columba and confirmed by miracles that all could witness. Their Easter calculations derived from methods blessed by apostolic authority. Their tonsure reflected the humility that Christ himself had demonstrated. Why abandon ways that had produced saints and scholars for Roman innovations that offered no clear spiritual advantage? Wilfrid answered for Rome with arguments that carried the weight of universal authority. Peter held the keys to heaven, and Peter's successors in Rome spoke with divine sanction that no local tradition could override. The Roman Easter united Christians throughout the world in common celebration, while Celtic calculations divided the Church and confused the faithful. England could not remain an island apart from Catholic Christendom if it hoped to claim a place among Christian nations. Oswio's decision in favor of Roman usage settled more than liturgical disputes. By choosing Rome over Celtic tradition, he aligned English Christianity with the universal Church and opened doors to continental influence that would reshape Anglo-Saxon culture. The defeated Celtic monks departed sadly for Ireland and Scotland, carrying with them cherished traditions, but leaving behind a church that would develop along thoroughly Roman lines. Northumbria emerged as the dominant power during these crucial decades, its combination of military might and Christian learning making it the natural leader of converted England. Oswald had died a martyr's death at Oswestry, his sanctity adding divine favor to Northumbrian claims of supremacy. Oswiu completed his brother's work, extending Northumbrian authority over neighboring kingdoms while establishing his court as a center of Christian scholarship. Theodore of Tarsus arrived as Archbishop of Canterbury with a mandate to organize English Christianity according to Roman principles. His Greek learning and Roman authority made him uniquely qualified to establish the episcopal structure that would govern the English Church for centuries to come. Under his guidance, dioceses took shape with clearly defined boundaries, while canonical law replaced local custom in ecclesiastical matters. Scholarship flourished in this new environment as Christian learning merged with Germanic curiosity about the wider world. Benedict Biscop traveled repeatedly to Rome, returning each time with manuscripts, relics, and craftsmen who could teach English monks the skills they needed to create their own centers of learning. His libraries at Wearmouth and Jarrow became legendary throughout Europe for their comprehensive collections of classical and Christian texts. Bede emerged from this scholarly ferment as the greatest mind of his generation, his works spanning history, theology, natural philosophy, and biblical commentary. His ecclesiastical history of the English people became the foundation text for understanding Anglo-Saxon conversion, while his scientific works established him as one of Europe's leading scholars. From his cell at Jarrow, he maintained correspondence with learned men throughout Christendom, making English scholarship a respected voice in continental debates. Art and architecture reflected the spiritual transformation that Christianity brought to Anglo-Saxon England. Stone churches replaced timber halls as the most impressive buildings in many settlements, their Roman arches and Mediterranean proportions introducing architectural concepts that had been forgotten since the legions departed. Master masons arrived from Gaul and Italy, teaching English craftsmen techniques that would create monuments worthy of the new faith. Illuminated manuscripts represented perhaps the highest achievement of this cultural fusion. The Lindisfarne Gospels combined Celtic interlace patterns with Mediterranean naturalism, creating a uniquely English artistic style that influenced manuscript production throughout Northern Europe. Gold and silver gleamed from vellum pages, while precious pigments brought color and life to sacred texts, transforming scripture into visual as well as spiritual revelation. Crosses began marking the landscape as permanent monuments to Christian victory over paganism. These stone pillars, carved with intricate patterns and biblical scenes, proclaimed the faith's triumph while serving as focal points for communities scattered across rural territories. The great crosses at Ruthwell and Bewcastle would become masterpieces of Anglo-Saxon sculpture, their carved verses among the earliest English poetry to survive in written form. Young nobles arrived at York's Cathedral School carrying nothing but their father's ambitions and their own hunger for knowledge. Here they learned Latin grammar from manuscripts copied in distant scriptoriums, practiced rhetoric that would serve them in royal courts, and studied mathematics that revealed the divine order underlying creation. Alcuin emerged from these halls to become Charlemagne's chief educator, carrying Anglo-Saxon learning to the heart of the Frankish Empire. Hilda of Whitby commanded both monks and nuns with the authority of an abbess whose wisdom drew pilgrims from across the known world. In her double monastery, noble daughters found power that surpassed what marriage could offer, while common-born women rose to positions of influence through scholarship and sanctity. When she died, 5 future bishops mourned at her funeral, testament to the leaders she had shaped through decades of spiritual guidance. Willibrord sailed from Northumbria's ports carrying more than the gospel. He bore Anglo-Saxon ambitions wrapped in missionary purpose. His success among the Frisians established English influence along the continental coastline, while his letters home brought continental learning to English monasteries. Boniface followed his example, leading English missionaries deep into German forests where Woden's altars still received blood sacrifices from unconverted tribes. Pilgrims streamed along the roads to Rome, their staffs and scripts marking them as travelers on sacred business. These journeys created fortunes for innkeepers and guides, while returning pilgrims brought Roman fashions, continental manuscripts, and news from distant lands. Archbishop Theodore's own journey from Tarsus to Canterbury had established patterns that thousands would follow, each trip strengthening the bonds that linked English churches to the wider world of faith. Marriage alliances now required careful consideration of religious compatibility alongside political advantage. When Ethelbert of East Anglia sought a bride for his son, he looked first to households where the new faith had taken deep root, understanding that mixed marriages between believer and pagan bred the conflicts that could tear kingdoms apart. Diplomatic correspondence increasingly opened with prayers and closed with blessings, assuming shared beliefs that transcended tribal boundaries. Oaths sworn on sacred relics carried weight that mere words could never achieve. In Canterbury's courts, men placed their hands on bones of martyrs while speaking truth, knowing that perjury before such witnesses would bring divine punishment swift as lightning. Church courts claimed authority over marriage disputes and moral offenses, creating parallel systems of justice that competed with secular law, while claiming higher sanction for their judgments. By the century's end, Christianity had transformed Anglo-Saxon England beyond recognition. Where pagan warriors had once gathered in timber halls to hear songs of ancestral heroes, Christian communities now assembled in stone churches to celebrate the Eucharist and hear sermons on eternal salvation. The conversion was more than religious. It was cultural, intellectual, and political transformation that positioned England to play a leading role in medieval European civilization. The stage was set for the great achievements of the 8th century, when Anglo-Saxon Christianity would reach its golden age under leaders like Alcuin of York and the scholarly communities that had grown from Augustine's initial mission. The seeds of conversion had produced a harvest that would nourish European learning through the darkest periods ahead, while the institutional structures created during these crucial decades would provide stability through centuries of political upheaval. The river Winwed bore witness as Pender of Mercia fell beneath Northumbrian spears, his last stand bringing one era to a close and another to life. The last great pagan ruler fell fighting the men who served the Christ he had refused to acknowledge, his death clearing the way for a new kind of power that would emerge from the heartlands of Middle England. Wulfr inherited more than his father's throne. He claimed the ambitions that had driven Pender's wars and the strategic vision that recognized Mercia's natural advantages. Where Pender had wielded sword and spear to carve supremacy from rival realms, his son understood that lasting dominance required subtler tools. Gold could purchase what bronze alone could never secure, while marriage alliances could bind former enemies more firmly than military conquest. The heartland pulsed with advantages that geography had bestowed like gifts from the gods themselves. Rivers converged at strategic points where Roman roads still carried trade between distant territories. Salt wells in Droitwich produced wealth that flowed like silver into royal treasuries, while iron deposits in the western hills armed warriors whose loyalty could be purchased with shares of the profits. Tamworth commanded crossroads where merchants from every realm met to exchange goods and gossip. Ethelbald seized the throne through methods that chroniclers preferred not to record in detail. His path to power paved with the bodies of rivals who had underestimated his ruthlessness. Once established at Tamworth, he revealed ambitions that stretched far beyond mere survival. His charters would eventually style him Rex Britannia, south of the Humber, a title that acknowledged no equal among his contemporaries, and recognized no authority above his own save God's. London submitted to his authority without the siege that many expected, its merchants calculating that profitable submission served their interests better than heroic resistance. The city's position, controlling Thames trade, made it invaluable to any ruler with continental ambitions, while its revenues could fund the kind of diplomacy that transformed military victory into permanent supremacy. Ethelbald's control of London marked his emergence as the dominant power in southern England. Kent discovered that ancient independence meant little when faced with determined expansion, backed by superior resources. The realm that had welcomed Augustine and given laws to the Anglo-Saxon world found itself reduced to dependency. Its rulers permitted to reign only as long as they acknowledged their subservience to Tamworth. The humiliation cut deeply into Kentish pride. but resistance would have brought total annexation rather than mere submission. Sussex and Essex followed Kent into the growing sphere of influence, their rulers calculating that voluntary submission offered better terms than conquest would provide. These smaller realms retained their identity and local customs while accepting supremacy in matters of war, diplomacy, and tribute. The arrangement satisfied all parties. The lesser rulers maintained their dignity while Ethelbald gained control without the expense of permanent occupation. East Anglia resisted longer than its neighbors. The Wolfingers' pride sustained by memories of the treasures buried at Sutton, and the wealth that flowed through their ports from continental trade. Their resistance ended not in glorious battle but in negotiated surrender, their ambassadors discovering that gold could purchase Frankish neutrality and leave the East Anglian realm isolated beyond hope of effective support. The great ruler's accession transformed ambitions from regional dominance into something approaching imperial vision. Where Ethelbald had been content to acknowledge the superiority of Frankish courts, his successor corresponded with Charlemagne as an equal, their letters discussing trade disputes, marriage alliances, and territorial boundaries with the formality reserved for negotiations between sovereign powers. The great dike that bears his name stretched across the landscape like a statement carved in earth and stone, its earthworks marking more than mere boundary between his territories and the Welsh realms. Here was frontier fortification on a scale not seen since Roman times, a barrier that required coordination of labor resources across multiple domains and engineering skills that few contemporary rulers could command. Construction gangs labored through seasons of backbreaking work, their efforts supervised by engineers who understood both defensive architecture and the symbolic importance of creating a monument that would proclaim power to future generations. The dike ran for over 100 miles, its ramparts and ditches creating a frontier that channeled trade, controlled movement, and demonstrated the organizational capacity that set him apart from his contemporaries. Welsh princes found their raiding opportunities suddenly curtailed by this massive earthwork, their traditional routes into English territory blocked by fortifications that would require siege equipment to breach. The economic impact proved as significant as the military effects. Trade now flowed through designated crossing points where officials could collect tolls and monitor the movement of goods between two worlds. Diplomatic correspondence flowed between his court and Charlemagne's capital, their negotiations covering matters that ranged from commercial disputes to marriage proposals that would unite English and Frankish bloodlines. These exchanges revealed the sophistication of 8th century statecraft, with trained diplomats conducting negotiations that required knowledge of law, custom, and the delicate balance of interests that kept peace between neighboring powers. The proposed marriage between Ealhsfrith and one of Charlemagne's daughters collapsed over questions of precedence that revealed the limits of English pretensions. When the great ruler demanded that his daughter receive equal consideration as a bride for Charlemagne's son, the Frankish emperor's refusal demonstrated that continental powers still viewed Anglo-Saxon leaders as provincial kinglets rather than true equals. Trade disputes followed diplomatic failures as English ports closed to Frankish merchants in retaliation for perceived slights. The economic warfare that resulted caused hardship on both sides of the Channel, proving that commercial interdependence had progressed to the point where political disputes could no longer be separated from economic consequences. Eventually, practical necessity forced both rulers to resume normal relations despite their personal animosity. Monetary reform marked another aspect of imperial ambitions, silver pennies replacing the diverse coinages that had circulated throughout Anglo-Saxon England. These coins bore royal images and titles in imitation of Roman imperial practice, while their consistent weight and purity facilitated trade throughout the territories. The economic integration that resulted from monetary standardization strengthened central control more effectively than military occupation could have achieved. Papal relations reached new heights of complexity during this reign as the ambitious ruler sought to establish an archbishopric at Lichfield that would free local churches from Canterbury's authority. His success in obtaining papal approval for this innovation demonstrated the reach of his influence, while the bitter opposition it generated among Kentish clergy revealed the religious dimensions of political rivalry. Lichfield's brief period as an archbishopric allowed the coronation of Ecgfrith as co-ruler in ceremonies that emphasized independence from traditional ecclesiastical authority. The young prince's coronation followed Frankish models that stressed divine sanction for secular power, creating precedents that would influence royal ideology throughout the Anglo-Saxon period. Ecgfrith's death within months of his coronation shattered dynastic plans and exposed the fragility of personal rule in an age when authority depended entirely on the character and capacity of individual rulers. The succession crisis that followed demonstrated that even the most successful Anglo-Saxon realms remained vulnerable to the biological lottery that determined which sons would survive to inherit their father's ambitions. Learning flourished under royal patronage as the court attracted scholars whose skills served both practical and propaganda purposes. Charters produced by scribes displayed calligraphy that rivaled anything created in contemporary Frankish scriptoriums, while the legal documents they recorded demonstrated administrative sophistication that few European courts could match. The tribal heitage, a document that listed the tribute obligations of various peoples within the sphere of influence, revealed the extent of central control while providing insights into the administrative methods that sustained such extensive dominion. This text named territories from the Humber to the Thames, assessing their capacity to provide warriors and tribute according to calculations that reflected both ancient custom and contemporary political reality. Artistic production reached new heights as workshops produced luxury goods that competed successfully with continental imports. Jewelry excavated from 8th-century sites displays technical mastery and aesthetic sophistication that contradicted any assumption of Anglo-Saxon cultural inferiority, while architectural remains from churches demonstrate ambitions that match the finest contemporary buildings in Frankish Gaul. Regional administration developed to manage territories that stretched far beyond the traditional boundaries of settlement. Aldermen exercised vice-regal authority in distant provinces. Their power derived from appointment rather than hereditary right. Their loyalty maintained through rewards that included both treasure and the prestige that came from association with successful expansion. Military organization evolved to meet the challenges of ruling diverse populations across extensive territories. The traditional warband system that had served earlier rulers expanded into something approaching professional administration, with specialists in law, finance, and diplomacy supporting the warriors who remained the ultimate guarantors of authority. Succession arrangements reflected the tension between Germanic tradition and the stability requirements of complex government. While custom demanded that blood determine eligibility for the throne, practical necessity favored succession plans that prevented civil war between rival claimants. The attempts to secure Ecgfrith's inheritance demonstrated both the importance of dynastic continuity and the difficulties of achieving it. The network of estates that supported government stretched across multiple realms, their revenues flowing into central treasuries that funded the administration, diplomacy, and military activities that maintained supremacy over subordinate rulers. These estates represented more than economic resources. They served as symbols of authority and bases for the officials who represented power in distant territories. Rhodri the Great received news of English expansion with the grim satisfaction of a man who had expected treachery from his neighbors. The Welsh prince commanded warriors who remembered every slight, every burned village, every cattle raid that had marked the long struggle between Celt and Saxon. When his spies reported movement along the Great Dyke, he gathered his spearmen in the mountain strongholds that had never known foreign conquest. The clash came at Rhuddlan, where Welsh fury met English discipline in combat that lasted from dawn until the shadows grew long. Rhodri's men fought with the desperation of defenders protecting their children's inheritance, while English forces advanced with the confidence of warriors accustomed to victory. Blood soaked the earth between two peoples who shared nothing save their hatred for each other. Coenwulf inherited a realm that stretched from the Humber to the Thames, its extent marking the high tide of central English power. The new ruler faced challenges that his predecessor had never confronted. Viking ships appeared off the coast with increasing frequency, their dragon-headed prows promising the kind of warfare that would test every assumption about military supremacy. Scribes in the royal chancery labored over documents that recorded grants, confirmed boundaries, and established the legal frameworks that bound diverse populations under single authority. Their elegant Latin phrases transformed oral agreements into written law, while their careful calligraphy proclaimed the sophistication of a court that could compete with any contemporary center of learning. Egbert of Wessex watched these developments from his exile in Charlemagne's court, his eyes fixed on the inheritance that civil war had stolen from him. The West Saxon prince understood that patient waiting served ambition better than premature action, but he also recognized that every year of Central English dominance made eventual restoration more difficult to achieve. By the century's end, the Midland realm had achieved a dominance over Anglo-Saxon England that would have seemed impossible when Pender fell at Winwed. Through a combination of military success, diplomatic skill, and administrative innovation, these rulers had created the closest approximation to unified government that the Anglo-Saxon world had yet seen. The foundations were laid for the greater achievements and greater challenges that the 9th century would bring. Fire consumed the monastery of Lindisfarne as dragon-headed ships retreated into the summer darkness, their holds heavy with gold torn from altar screens and silver stripped from reliquaries. The year 793 carved itself into Anglo-Saxon memory, like a blade cutting through flesh, marking the moment when the North Sea ceased to be a protective barrier and became a highway for terror. Brothers who had spent their lives copying sacred texts now lay butchered among the ruins of their scriptorium, their blood-darkening vellum pages that had taken years to illuminate. Alcuin's letter to the Northumbrian court carried shock that bordered on theological crisis. Writing from Charlemagne's palace, the great scholar struggled to comprehend how God could permit such desecration of holy ground. Never before has such terror appeared in Britain as we have now suffered from a pagan race, he wrote, his elegant Latin barely containing the horror that gripped Christian kingdoms. The heathens poured out the blood of saints around the altar and trampled on the bodies of saints in the temple of God like dung in the streets. These raiders called themselves Vikings, though their victims knew them simply as the terror that came from the sea. In their homeland, fjords, younger sons faced the harsh mathematics of inheritance that left them with choices between poverty and adventure. Population growth had outstripped the capacity of Scandinavian soil to support ambitious warriors, while successful raids to the south had demonstrated that richer lands lay within reach of bold men who dared to risk everything for the chance of fortune. Ragnar's sons would become legends carved in blood across the map of northern Europe, But in 793 they were still learning their trade through smaller expeditions that tested Anglo-Saxon defenses. These early raids targeted monasteries not from religious hatred, but from practical calculation. Churches hoarded wealth without maintaining the warriors needed to protect it, their treasure chambers filled with gold and silver that could not fight back when Norse axes broke down their doors. Jarrow burned the following year, its magnificent library feeding flames that consumed centuries of scholarly labor in a single afternoon. The monastery that had nurtured Bede fell to raiders who understood nothing of the treasures they destroyed, their axes splitting apart manuscripts that represented the accumulated wisdom of ages. Books that had survived the fall of Rome perished beneath Viking steel, their knowledge scattered to the winds like ashes from a funeral pyre. Rathlin Island witnessed slaughter that shocked even hardened warriors accustomed to the casual brutalities of medieval warfare. The Irish monastery had offered sanctuary to refugees from the Scottish raids, its walls sheltering men, women, and children who believed that holy ground would protect them from earthly violence. The Vikings proved that pagan steel cared nothing for sacred boundaries, their swords drinking deeply of innocent blood, while their ships prepared to carry fresh wealth back to Scandinavian halls. Iona fell to Norwegian axes in 795, its ancient sanctity no protection against men who served gods that demanded blood and battle. The monastery that had sent Aidan to convert Northumbria saw its monks scattered to the winds, its treasures loaded onto ships that would carry Celtic gold to decorate Norse halls. Columba's legacy lay in ashes, his life's work undone by warriors who measured success in silver rather than souls. These early raids established patterns that would govern Viking strategy for generations. Strike swiftly before defenders could organize, target wealth concentrated in defenseless locations, retreat before superior forces could arrive. The tactics worked because Anglo-Saxon military organization had evolved to fight other Anglo-Saxon armies, not seaborne raiders who could appear without warning and vanish before pursuit could organize. Beorhtric of Wessex discovered the limitations of traditional defense when 3 Norwegian ships appeared off the Dorset coast in 789. His reeve at Portland rode out to greet what he assumed were merchants seeking permission to trade, only to meet his death beneath Viking weapons that honored no law save strength. The raiders departed with their holds full of plunder and their confidence confirmed. These wealthy kingdoms could be raided with impunity. Egbert's return from Frankish exile brought new energy to West Saxon resistance against both Viking raiders and the failing grip of Central English supremacy. His years at Charlemagne's court had taught him continental methods of warfare and diplomacy, while his burning desire for revenge against the rulers who had driven him from his inheritance provided motivation sharper than any blade. At Ellendun he shattered the army that had maintained hegemony over southern England, his victory announcing that the balance of power was shifting once again. Kent, Sussex, and Essex threw off allegiance to Tamworth with the enthusiasm of vassals who had long chafed under foreign domination. Their submission to Egbert marked more than political realignment. It represented the emergence of Wessex as the leading power among the southern realms, the one force capable of organizing effective resistance against the growing Norse threat. Raids intensified throughout the 830s as Scandinavian fighters grew bolder with success and more desperate as population pressure increased in their homelands. No coast remained safe from their depredations, no monastery secure from their greed. They struck at Sheppey, carried off loot from Canterbury's suburbs, and sailed up rivers that had never known foreign keels to burn settlements that had considered themselves beyond the reach of seaborne attack. The great army that chroniclers would call the Great Heathen Host assembled in Danish harbors during the winter of 864 to 865, its ships gathering like wolves before a hunt. Ivar the Boneless commanded respect that transcended his physical limitations, his strategic genius more than compensating for the brittle bones that made him unable to walk without assistance. Halfdan Whiteshirt brought the fury of a warrior whose reputation for battlefield prowess had spread throughout the Norse world. Ubb carried axes that thirsted for Anglo-Saxon blood and ambitions that reached far beyond mere raiding. These were no longer raiders seeking quick profit but conquerors planning permanent settlement. Their army numbered in thousands rather than hundreds, its supply trains prepared for sustained campaigning rather than swift strikes. Horses waited in their ships to carry Norse fighters deep into enemy territory, while siege equipment demonstrated that they intended to reduce fortified positions rather than merely plunder the countryside. York fell to the invaders in 866, its capture marking the effective end of Northumbrian independence. The great city that had once rivaled Canterbury as a center of learning became the capital of a Norse realm. Its churches converted to pagan temples, while its citizens learned to serve new masters whose gods demanded different sacrifices. Archbishop Wulfr fled south with what treasures he could carry, leaving behind a diocese that would not see another Anglo-Saxon bishop for generations. Nottingham's siege revealed the coordination that bound the great army together, despite the fierce independence of its component war bands. Where earlier raiders had operated as separate groups seeking individual profit, these Norsemen moved with the discipline of a professional force directed toward common goals. Their siege techniques had been learned in campaigns against Frankish fortifications, while their tactical flexibility demonstrated that they had studied Anglo-Saxon military methods with the attention of students planning to surpass their teachers. Ella of Northumbria met his end in York's Hall, his death marking the extinction of the dynasty that had once ruled from the Humber to the Forth. The manner of his execution would become legend among the Norsemen. The blood eagle that Ivar ordered, carved into the fallen ruler's back, served as both revenge for earlier slights and warning to other leaders who might consider resistance. The message was clear: submit or share Ella's fate. Edmund of East Anglia chose martyrdom over surrender when the great army reached his territories in 869. The young ruler could have fled to Frankish exile or purchased peace through tribute, but his conscience would not permit collaboration with pagans who desecrated churches and slaughtered innocents. His death beneath Norse arrows transformed him into a saint whose cult would inspire resistance for centuries to come. London's fall sent shock waves through every remaining court, its capture demonstrating that even the greatest cities could not stand against sustained assault. The wealthy merchants who had grown rich on continental trade found their gold counting for nothing when Norse axes broke down their gates. Their goods filled the ships while their bodies fed the ravens that had learned to follow the great army's advance. Alfred inherited Wessex at the moment when defeat seemed inevitable, his older brothers having died fighting enemies whose numbers seemed inexhaustible. The young ruler faced a simple choice: flee into exile and preserve his life, or remain and fight for a crown that might prove worthless if his enemies could not be defeated. His decision to stand and fight would reshape these lands' history, but in 871 that outcome remained far from certain. Ashdown provided the first clear proof that Vikings could be defeated by English arms, Alfred's tactical genius combining with his brother Ethelred's battlefield courage to achieve victory against odds that had seemed overwhelming. The battle demonstrated that Norse warriors, for all their reputation for invincibility, bled like other men when faced with determined resistance led by competent commanders. The victory's effects proved temporary as fresh Viking reinforcements continued arriving from across the North Sea. Each English success brought new challenges as Scandinavian jarls recognized that the conquest of England required greater commitment than seasonal raiding could provide. The great army swelled with recruits drawn by tales of English wealth and the prospect of carving kingdoms from conquered territory. Ethelred's death left Alfred facing enemies who controlled most of northern and eastern England, while commanding resources that dwarfed anything Wessex could muster. The new ruler's survival depended on strategies that had never been tested in Anglo-Saxon warfare. Mobile defense, strategic retreats, and the kind of patient endurance that could outlast enemies accustomed to swift decision. What he learned in these desperate months would alter the military traditions of the land forever. Athelney became the symbol of resistance when Alfred withdrew to its marshes with the remnants of his army. The island's stronghold provided security for the royal court while serving as a base for guerrilla operations that harried Viking forces throughout Somerset. From this unlikely refuge, the last independent ruler of the land began planning the campaign that would either restore his kingdom or complete its destruction. The victory at Edington in 878 marked the turning point in the Viking conquest of England, Alfred's reformed army proving that English warriors could match Norse ferocity when properly led and adequately motivated. Guthrum's baptism following his defeat transformed the Viking leader from pagan conqueror into nominal ally, though both parties understood that this conversion represented political necessity rather than genuine religious conviction. The Treaty of Wedmore divided England between the English and the Danes, creating the boundary that would separate two civilizations for generations to come. Alfred retained Wessex and Western Mercia, while Guthrum received official recognition for his control over the territories that would become known as the Danelaw. The agreement brought peace, but both sides knew it was temporary, a breathing space in a struggle that could only end with total victory for one side or the other. Fortified burhs began rising across Wessex like mushrooms after rain, each stronghold positioned to provide refuge for local populations while serving as a base for military operations. These fortifications represented more than defensive architecture. They embodied Alfred's understanding that Viking mobility could only be countered by creating permanent strong points that would force raiders to fight on English terms. Alongside military reform came an educational revival, driven by Alfred's belief that ignorance had contributed to his realm's defeats. The ruler who had learned Latin while fighting for his life now sponsored translations that would make learning accessible to nobles whose education had been neglected during decades of warfare. His translation of Gregory's Pastoral Care carried prefaces that revealed a mind grappling with the relationship between earthly knowledge and eternal salvation. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle began during these years, as Alfred scholars sought to preserve English history while it was still being written. Their annual entries recorded the Viking Wars with the immediacy of participants while providing context that reached back to the earliest Saxon settlements. This historical project represented more than mere record-keeping. It constituted an attempt to maintain English identity in the face of foreign conquest. By the century's end, the Viking storm had transformed Anglo-Saxon England beyond recognition. 3 of the 7 kingdoms had ceased to exist as independent entities, their territories divided among Norse jarls who acknowledged no native authority. Those rulers who survived did so by adapting to new realities. Their military methods reformed, and their ambitions tempered by the hard lessons of what resistance to superior force could cost. Alfred's survival ensured that some spark of the realm's independence would endure to kindle future resistance, but the cost of that survival had been immense. The scholarly achievements of the 8th century lay in ruins. The political unity that Central English rulers had achieved was shattered, and the confidence that had marked Anglo-Saxon civilization since the conversion period would require generations to restore. The Vikings had come to stay, and England would never be the same. Edward the Elder stood at the ramparts of Chester, his eyes scanning the Welsh hills where smoke still rose from the burned settlements of raiders who had mistaken his mercy for weakness. The son of Alfred carried his father's strategic genius wrapped in a harder heart, his campaigns pushing West Saxon authority northward with methodical precision that left no doubt about his intentions. Where Alfred had fought for survival, Edward fought for dominion. Ethelflaed rode beside her brother in spirit, if not always in person, her fortress at Tamworth commanding the approaches to Danish Mercia, while her spies reported every movement in the territories they meant to reclaim. The Lady of the Mercians understood warfare as few women of her generation could claim, her fortifications rising across the Midlands like chess pieces positioned for a game that would determine the fate of Anglo-Saxon civilization. The burh at Brignorth crowned its hill like a crown of stone and timber, its walls enclosing enough space to shelter the population of an entire district when Norse raiders came calling. Ethelflaed herself supervised the construction, her presence among the workers demonstrating that royal authority meant more than distant commands issued from comfortable halls. Each fortification she built became both sanctuary and statement. The Danes could be challenged. Their dominion was not permanent. Runcorn's walls rose under her direct supervision, the fortress positioned to control river traffic along the Mersey, while providing a base for operations deeper into Danish territory. The lady watched as masons fitted stones with the precision of jewelers setting gems, understanding that each perfectly placed block represented another step toward the restoration of native rule. Her engineers had learned their craft from Frankish experts, but the vision that guided their work was purely Anglo-Saxon. Warwick emerged as another jewel in her defensive network, its strategic position commanding the approaches from the north while serving as a supply depot for armies operating in hostile territory. The fortress housed not just garrison troops but workshops where smiths forged weapons according to patterns that combined traditional craftsmanship with innovations learned from captured Danish equipment. Every spear point and sword blade represented both practical necessity and symbolic defiance of foreign occupation. Edward's campaigns followed patterns established during his father's desperate years, but applied them with the confidence of a ruler who commanded superior resources. His army struck swiftly at isolated Danish positions, withdrew before superior forces could concentrate against them, then returned when enemies least expected renewed assault. The tactics that had once preserved Wessex now served to expand its boundaries beyond anything previous rulers had imagined possible. Derby fell to the combined forces of brother and sister in 917, its capture marking the first major breakthrough in the systematic reconquest of the Danelaw. The city that had served as one of the 5 boroughs found itself surrounded by West Saxon and Mercian forces, whose coordination revealed months of careful planning. When the gates finally opened, they revealed not just military victory, but the beginning of a new phase in the struggle for supremacy. The siege had lasted 3 weeks, each day bringing fresh evidence that Danish resolve was crumbling under pressure that never relented. Edward's engineers had positioned siege engines with mathematical precision, their stone-throwing devices reducing sections of wall to rubble while crossbowmen prevented effective repairs. Inside the city, food supplies dwindled as the population realized that no relief force would arrive to break the encirclement. Danish jarls who had ruled Derby for generations found themselves facing a choice between honorable death and pragmatic submission. Thurforth, the jarl, chose exile over execution, loading his family's treasures onto carts, while his warriors debated whether to follow their lord into uncertain futures or seek terms with the conquerors. The decision split families and destroyed friendships, its effects rippling through the Danish community for years to come. Nottingham surrendered without a siege when its Danish inhabitants realized that resistance meant destruction, while submission offered the chance to retain their lands and lives. The pragmatic calculation that saved the city demonstrated how thoroughly the military balance had shifted. Where once Norse jarls had commanded from positions of strength, now they negotiated from weakness with rulers who held both initiative and superior resources. The surrender ceremony in Nottingham's Great Hall revealed the complexity of emotions that accompanied conquest and submission. Danish nobles knelt before Edward while retaining their dignity, their formal words of allegiance masking calculations about future opportunities for revenge or advancement. The conqueror accepted their oaths with the understanding that loyalty purchased through fear required constant vigilance to maintain. Stamford's walls bore scars from the brief assault that preceded its surrender, the damage serving as permanent reminder of what happened to communities that chose resistance over negotiation. The town's merchants had calculated correctly that their prosperity depended more on peaceful trade than heroic gestures, their quick submission earning them favorable terms that preserved both lives and properties. Market stalls reopened within days of the conquest, their owners adapting to new rulers with the flexibility that commerce demanded. York remained beyond immediate reach, its Danish rulers still powerful enough to threaten any force that advanced too far north without adequate preparation. Sitrick Kek commanded warriors whose loyalty to Norse traditions ran deeper than mere political convenience, while his marriage connections to Dublin's rulers promised reinforcements that could tip any balance back towards Scandinavian advantage. The northern capital would require different strategies than those that had succeeded in the Midlands. Intelligence reports from York described a city preparing for siege, its granaries filled with supplies, while its walls received fresh fortifications designed by engineers who understood the latest developments in military architecture. Sitrick had learned from the defeats of his southern neighbors, his preparations demonstrating that the northern kingdom would not fall as easily as Derby or Nottingham had yielded to southern pressure. Leicester opened its gates to Edward's forces in 918, completing the liberation of the Eastern Midlands and demonstrating that systematic pressure could accomplish what dramatic gestures might not achieve. The city's submission brought more than strategic advantage. It provided the resources and population needed to consolidate gains while preparing for the next phase of expansion. The celebration feast in Leicester's Royal Hall brought together Danish nobles who had chosen submission and Anglo-Saxon commanders who had led the victorious armies. Former enemies shared meat and mead while negotiating the practical arrangements that would govern their future relationships. Intermarriage between Danish heiresses and West Saxon nobles began creating bonds that transcended the ethnic divisions which had once seemed absolute. Ethelflaed's death at Tamworth deprived the reconquest of its most capable military mind, her passing removing from the battlefield a leader whose strategic vision had complemented her brother's tactical skills. The Lady of the Merchants died before seeing the completion of her work, but her fortifications would continue serving the cause of unification long after her body rested in Gloucester's royal cemetery. Her funeral drew mourners from throughout the territories she had helped liberate. Danish nobles joining Anglo-Saxon thence in honoring a woman whose enemies had learned to respect her abilities even while cursing her success. The ceremony in Gloucester's cathedral demonstrated how thoroughly she had transformed the political landscape, her achievements providing the foundation upon which future rulers would build. Edward's annexation of Mercia following his sister's death revealed ambitions that stretched beyond mere cooperation between allied domains. The West Saxon ruler understood that lasting unification required single authority rather than the kind of fraternal alliance that had served during the Reconquest phase. His occupation of Tamworth announced to every remaining Danish stronghold that they faced not just another Anglo-Saxon realm, but the emerging power that would reshape the political map. The integration of Mercian troops into West Saxon armies proceeded with surprising smoothness. Former rivals discovering that shared enemies created stronger bonds than ethnic differences could dissolve. Mercian expertise in fighting Danish forces complemented West Saxon organizational skills, their combination producing military capabilities that surpassed what either force could achieve independently. Administrative reforms accompanied territorial expansion as Edward's government developed systems capable of managing domains that stretched far beyond traditional boundaries. Royal officials learned to balance local customs with central authority, their success in maintaining order demonstrating that conquest could be transformed into lasting governance when properly managed. Athelstan inherited an inheritance that his grandfather could never have imagined, dominion over most of the territory that had once comprised the Anglo-Saxon heptarchy, resources that dwarfed any previous concentration of power, and the military momentum that promised to carry West Saxon authority to its natural limits. The new ruler possessed advantages that transcended mere territorial control, his court attracting refugees and exiles whose knowledge of distant lands would serve his diplomatic ambitions. Continental marriages linked the West Saxon dynasty to Frankish and German noble houses, their alliance networks extending royal influence across the Channel while providing security against potential invasions. Athelstan's sisters carried royal blood to foreign courts where their children would grow up understanding that their inheritance connected them to both Germanic traditions and emerging European political structures. The submission at Eymont Bridge in 927 brought together rulers whose domains stretched from the Humber to the Highlands, their acknowledgement of Athelstan's overlordship marking a moment when dreams of unity briefly touched reality. Constantine of Scotland, Owain of Strathclyde, and Hywel Dudder of Wales bent their knees before a West Saxon ruler whose authority none could challenge directly, though all secretly planned for the day when circumstances might allow them to reclaim their independence. The ceremony itself revealed the careful choreography required when proud rulers acknowledged superior power without entirely sacrificing their dignity. Each submission followed protocols that preserved face while establishing hierarchy. The participants understanding that today's arrangements might be tomorrow's grievances if circumstances changed. Athelstan received their oaths with the graciousness of a conqueror who understood that magnanimity and victory could prevent future rebellions. Guthrith's invasion from Dublin tested these new arrangements with the harsh reality of Norse ambitions that refused to accept West Saxon dominance as permanent. The Dublin ruler commanded ships that could strike anywhere along the western coast while maintaining connections to York that promised to restore Scandinavian control over northern territories. His challenge forced Athelstan to demonstrate that overlordship meant more than ceremonial acknowledgement. It demanded the willingness to fight for supremacy when words proved insufficient. The naval campaign that followed demonstrated how thoroughly warfare had evolved since Alfred's desperate years. West Saxon ships now matched Norse vessels in both design and seamanship. Their crews trained in tactics that combined traditional courage with innovative techniques learned from Frankish and Frisian maritime traditions. The battles fought off the Irish coast established maritime supremacy that would prove crucial in preventing future invasions. York's capture in 927 completed the conquest of the last major Danish stronghold, its submission bringing Northumbria under southern authority for the first time since the Great Army's invasions. The ancient capital of northern power found itself governed by appointees who owed their positions to West Saxon favor, its independence sacrificed to the greater goal of territorial unification under single rule. The transformation of York from Danish capital to West Saxon administrative center required delicate handling of populations whose loyalties remained divided. Former Danish officials found themselves working alongside Anglo-Saxon administrators, their cooperation essential for maintaining order, while their resentment simmered beneath the surface of apparent acceptance. The city's prosperity depended on this uneasy collaboration succeeding, despite the ethnic tensions that conquest had created. Coastal defenses strengthened as Athelstan's administrators recognized that seaborne threats would persist as long as Irish Norse realms retained the ships and warriors needed for invasion attempts. Fortifications rose as strategic points along the western approaches, their garrisons trained to signal inland when hostile sails appeared on the horizon. The emerging realm understood that control of the interior meant little if enemies could still strike without warning from the sea. Beacon systems connected coastal watchtowers to inland strongholds, their fire signals capable of summoning military response faster than any messenger could travel. The technology had been borrowed from Roman precedents but adapted to Anglo-Saxon needs, creating communication networks that enhanced defensive capabilities while demonstrating the administrative sophistication that distinguished unified rule from mere temporary conquest. Trade networks expanded as political unification removed barriers that had hindered commerce between formerly hostile territories. Merchants who had once required armed escorts to travel between domains now moved their goods under the protection of a single authority whose laws ran from the Channel to the Scottish borders. London emerged as the natural center of this expanded commerce, its position on the Thames making it the focal point for both domestic and continental trade. Silver coins bearing Athelstan's image circulated throughout the unified territories, their consistent weight and purity facilitating transactions while proclaiming royal authority in every market town. The monetary system that emerged from unification created economic integration that complemented political control, binding formerly separate regions together through networks of debt, credit, and commercial obligation that transcended ethnic boundaries. Continental connections deepened as Athelstan's court established diplomatic relationships that reflected the realm's new status among European powers. Marriage negotiations with Frankish nobles demonstrated that West Saxon authority commanded respect beyond the Channel, while religious connections to Rome brought prestige that enhanced the legitimacy of unified rule. The isolated domain that Alfred had struggled to preserve now participated as an equal in the wider world of medieval diplomacy. Brunanburh loomed on the horizon like a storm cloud gathering strength, its approaching battle promising to test every assumption about the permanence of West Saxon dominance. Constantine of Scotland had spent years building alliances with Irish Norse rulers whose ships could carry armies to any point along the coast, while Olaf of Dublin commanded warriors whose reputation for ferocity had been earned in battles across the known world. The coalition that assembled against Athelstan represented the combined strength of everyone who refused to accept southern supremacy as the natural order. Thunder rolled across the battlefield of Brunanburh as two civilizations collided in combat that would determine the fate of a unified realm. Athelstan's forces held the center while his enemies pressed forward with the desperation of men who knew this battle would either restore their independence or confirm their subjugation forever. Constantine of Scotland commanded the right wing of the Allied army, his spearmen advancing in tight formation toward West Saxon shields that gleamed like silver in the morning light. Olaf Gudfridsson led Dublin's Norse warriors with the fury of a man reclaiming his birthright, his axes singing their ancient song of death, while his voice rose above the clash of arms to encourage fighters whose grandfathers had carved kingdoms from this same soil. The young ruler understood that victory here would open the path to York and the restoration of Scandinavian power in northern territories that southern overlords had ruled for barely a decade. 5 kings fell beneath West Saxon spears before the sun reached its zenith, their deaths marking the price that ambition exacted from those who challenged established power without adequate preparation. Among the slain lay princes whose names would have echoed through generations if fortune had favored their cause, their bodies testament to the reality that courage alone could not overcome superior organization and battlefield discipline. The pursuit continued long after resistance collapsed, Athelstan's cavalry hunting down enemies who had abandoned formation in desperate attempts to reach ships waiting along distant coasts. Few of those who fled the field would see their homelands again, their bones destined to whiten on English soil, while their families mourned losses that could never be recovered. The battle's aftermath demonstrated that decisive victory required not just winning the fight, but ensuring that defeated enemies lacked the strength to threaten future peace. Constantine retreated across the border with the remnant of his army, his dreams of southern expansion shattered against West Saxon resolve that had proven stronger than the combined forces of his coalition could break. The Scottish ruler would spend his remaining years consolidating power within his reduced territories, while nursing grievances that would poison relations between the kingdoms for generations to come. Dublin's influence in northern affairs waned as Olaf's defeat removed the last serious challenge to southern hegemony over territories that had once acknowledged Scandinavian overlordship. The Irish Norse kingdom would continue sending raiders across the narrow seas, but their expeditions lacked the strength to threaten unified resistance or the coordination needed to establish permanent footholds on hostile shores. Edgar inherited a realm at the height of its power, his coronation at Bath attended by rulers whose submission acknowledged realities that Brunanburg had established beyond challenge. The ceremony itself proclaimed imperial ambitions through rituals borrowed from continental precedents, the young ruler's anointing marking his elevation above mere tribal kingship towards something approaching the dignity that Roman emperors had once claimed. The famous scene at Chester, where 8 kings supposedly rowed Edgar's barge along the River Dee, embodied the mythology that surrounded unified rule, even if its historical accuracy remained questionable. Whether the event occurred exactly as chroniclers described mattered less than its symbolic significance. The image of subordinate rulers serving as oarsmen captured popular imagination while demonstrating the extent to which Southern authority had transformed the political landscape. Monastic reform flourished under Edgar's patronage as religious communities that had survived the Danish invasions received royal support for expansion and renewal. Dunstan of Canterbury led efforts to restore discipline and learning to foundations that had grown lax during the years of warfare, while Ethelwold of Winchester established new communities whose scholarly activities would influence European intellectual development for centuries to come. The Regularis Concordia created unified standards for monastic observance throughout the realm, its regulations ensuring that religious communities followed consistent practices while acknowledging royal authority over ecclesiastical appointments. The document represented more than religious reform. It established mechanisms through which secular power could influence spiritual life while drawing upon religious legitimacy to strengthen temporal authority. Economic prosperity accompanied political stability as trade networks flourished under protection that extended from the Channel to the Scottish borders. London's position as the commercial heart of the unified realm attracted merchants from across Europe, their activities generating revenues that supported both royal administration and military preparations against future threats. Silver flowed into royal treasuries from tolls, taxes, and tribute payments that demonstrated the economic advantages of unified rule. Coinage standardization reached new levels of sophistication under Edgar's administration, his silver pennies circulating throughout territories where local currencies had once reflected political fragmentation. The monetary system that emerged created economic integration that complemented political unity while providing mechanisms for taxation that previous rulers had never possessed. Legal unification proceeded gradually as royal law extended its authority over populations that retained strong attachments to local customs and traditional practices. The process required careful balance between central authority and regional autonomy. Royal judges learning to apply universal principles while respecting local variations that commanded popular loyalty and practical necessity. The 100-court system expanded to encompass territories that had never known such administrative organization. Local assemblies becoming instruments through which royal authority reached into the daily lives of farmers and craftsmen. These institutions provided mechanisms for maintaining order while creating networks of obligation that bound diverse populations to centralized government. Ethelred inherited challenges that his predecessors had never faced. Viking raids resuming with intensity that recalled the darkest years of the 9th century. The young ruler's nickname, Unready, meaning ill-advised rather than unprepared, reflected the quality of counsel he received rather than personal failings, though his reign would witness disasters that undid much of what 3 generations had achieved. The renewed Viking threat emerged from changed circumstances in Scandinavia where population pressure and political consolidation created both the necessity and capability for large-scale expeditions. Harald Bluetooth of Denmark commanded resources that dwarfed anything previous raiders had possessed, while his successors would prove even more ambitious in their designs upon the wealthy realm that lay across the narrow seas. Malden witnessed heroism and folly in equal measure when Berdnoth allowed Viking forces to cross the causeway rather than keep them trapped on Northey Island. The Elderman's decision reflected concepts of honor that belonged to an earlier age, his determination to fight fairly costing him his life, while demonstrating that traditional courage could not substitute for tactical wisdom in dealing with enemies who recognized no constraints save victory. The battle's aftermath revealed the inadequacy of traditional military organization when faced with professional raiders who understood the economic foundations of resistance. Berdnoth's death left Essex without effective leadership, while the Viking victory encouraged further expeditions that would test every assumption about the realm's ability to defend itself against sustained assault. Darngeld payments began as temporary expedients designed to purchase time for military preparations, but they became permanent features of royal policy as successive raids demonstrated the limits of armed resistance. The tribute system that emerged created perverse incentives that rewarded aggression while undermining the tax base needed to support effective defense. 10,000 pounds of silver purchased peace in 991, the sum representing wealth beyond the dreams of earlier ages, while demonstrating the economic prosperity that made such payments possible. The irony was bitter. Success in creating unified prosperity had made the realm an irresistible target for enemies whose own territories could not support equivalent populations or generate comparable revenues. The massacre of St. Brice's Day in 1002 revealed the desperation that drove English responses to what appeared to be inexorable Danish infiltration. Ethelred's order to kill all Danes living within his territories reflected panic rather than policy. The mass murder, including Gunhild, sister of Sweyn Forkbeard, whose death guaranteed that future conflicts would be driven by personal vengeance as well as political ambition. Sweyn's invasion campaigns that followed demonstrated the transformation of Viking warfare from opportunistic raiding into systematic conquest designed to establish permanent political control. The Danish ruler commanded fleets that could maintain multiple fronts simultaneously, while possessing the administrative capabilities needed to govern conquered territories rather than merely plunder them. Canterbury's fall in 1011 shocked contemporaries, who had believed that the spiritual heart of the unified realm would receive divine protection against pagan assault. Archbishop Elfia's martyrdom at the hands of drunken Vikings provided the realm with another saint, while demonstrating that religious authority offered no immunity from the violence that was consuming established order. Ethelred's flight to Normandy marked the effective end of West Saxon rule, the royal family's exile removing from the realm the symbolic focus around which resistance might have organized. The king's departure left the field clear for Danish conquest, while creating precedents that would influence succession disputes for generations to come. Sweyn's death in 1014 provided temporary respite that allowed Ethelred's restoration, but the interlude demonstrated the fragility of political arrangements that depended entirely on individual rulers rather than institutional continuity. When the Scandinavian monarch died without warning, his forces were torn by disputes over succession, allowing English nobles to press for self-rule. Canute's return with fresh forces ended whatever hope remained for sustained English resistance, the young Norse prince commanding resources that his father had only dreamed of possessing. The new ruler understood that permanent conquest required different methods than those that had served for raiding expeditions. His policies designed to integrate Norse and English populations under unified authority that transcended ethnic divisions. The Battle of Asanden in 1016 completed the Danish conquest, Edmund Ironside's defeat removing the last effective resistance to Scandinavian rule. The English prince had fought with courage that recalled the great defenders of earlier generations, but courage alone could not overcome the systematic approach that Canute brought to the business of conquest and governance. The agreement at Olney divided the realm between Edmund and Knut, but the English ruler's death within months of the treaty left the Danish prince as sole authority over territories that stretched from the Channel to the Scottish borders. The succession that followed demonstrated how thoroughly traditional political structures had collapsed under the pressure of sustained warfare and foreign invasion. Through his marriage to Emma of Normandy, Canute forged dynastic bonds that shaped European politics for centuries, showing his grasp that lasting legitimacy demanded more than battlefield success. The union linked Scandinavian power to Norman ambitions, while providing both parties with claims that would shape succession disputes long after the original contractors had died. The North Sea Empire that Canute created represented the high point of Scandinavian achievement in medieval Europe, his authority extending over territories that included England, Denmark, Norway, and parts of Sweden. The empire demonstrated what systematic organization could accomplish when applied to conquest and governance, but its existence depended entirely on the personal abilities of its creator. English nobles who had survived the conquest found themselves serving in an administration that valued competence above ethnic origin. Canute's policies creating opportunities for advancement that transcended traditional divisions. The integration that resulted produced a hybrid culture that combined Scandinavian political methods with English administrative traditions, creating governmental systems that influenced European development for generations. During Canute's reign, a synthesis emerged from conquest as Norse legal traditions blended with English precedents, creating systems that acknowledged both Germanic heritage and local custom. The resulting legislation brought stability after years of warfare and set precedents that shaped legal development long after Norse rule ended. In Chernet's England, religious patronage reached new heights as he sought to underpin his Christian legitimacy with deeds that surpassed political necessity. His Roman pilgrimage served as a public affirmation of faith, and his monastery donations forged alliances that blended armed rule with sacred authority. The succession crisis that followed Canute's death in 1035 revealed the fragility of personal rule in an age when institutional continuity remained underdeveloped. When Harold Harefoot and Harthacnut took separate shares of their father's legacy, their discord opened space for English nobles to reassert authority and showed that the realm's cohesion had been more illusion than fact. Edward the Confessor's restoration in 1042 marked the return of the West Saxon dynasty, but the realm he inherited bore little resemblance to what his ancestors had governed. 2 decades of Danish rule had transformed political structures, social relationships, and cultural patterns in ways that could not be easily reversed through dynastic change alone. The Godwin family's dominance during Edward's reign demonstrated how thoroughly the balance of power had shifted during the years of foreign rule. Earl Godwin and his sons commanded resources that rivaled royal authority while maintaining networks of support that extended throughout the realm, their position representing the emergence of new aristocratic structures that owed more to Danish precedents than English traditions. Norman influences grew stronger as Edward's reign progressed, his childhood connections to the duchy creating cultural and political ties that would prove decisive in determining succession arrangements. The Norman knights who began appearing in English service during the 1050s represented more than mere diplomatic exchange. They constituted the vanguard of changes that would transform the realm more thoroughly than Danish conquest had achieved. The succession crisis that followed Edward's death in 1066 brought to a climax tensions that had been building throughout his reign, competing claims based on different concepts of legitimacy, creating the conditions for civil war and foreign intervention. Harold Godwinson's coronation represented English determination to maintain independence, while William of Normandy's preparations across the Channel demonstrated that others possessed different ideas about who should rule. Stamford Bridge witnessed the last great victory of Anglo-Saxon arms as Harold's forces destroyed the Norwegian army that Harold Hardrada had brought to reclaim his supposed inheritance. The battle demonstrated that English military capabilities remained formidable when properly led and adequately motivated, but it also exhausted resources that would be desperately needed for the greater challenge that was approaching from the south. The news of William's landing reached Harold while he celebrated victory over the Norwegians, the timing demonstrating how thoroughly his enemies had coordinated their efforts to divide English resources between multiple threats. The forced march south that followed pushed English forces to their limits while providing insufficient time for recovery from the northern campaign's exertions. Hastings ended more than Harold's life. It terminated a political system that had endured for 6 centuries, replacing Anglo-Saxon kingship with Norman feudalism that would transform every aspect of English society. The battle's outcome determined not just dynastic succession, but the cultural trajectory that would shape the realm's development for centuries to come. William's coronation in Westminster Abbey on Christmas Day 1066 marked the end of the Anglo-Saxon Age, the Norman conquest completing transformations that Danish invasions had begun but never finished. The new ruler inherited a realm whose wealth had attracted conquerors for generations, but his methods of control would prove more systematic and enduring than any his predecessors had attempted. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle's final entries recorded these events with the detachment of observers who understood they were witnessing the end of their world, their words preserving for posterity the memory of a civilization that had risen from Germanic settlements to create one of medieval Europe's most sophisticated kingdoms. That achievement would endure even as political control passed to foreign rulers, whose ambitions would reshape the conquered territories according to continental models. The age that had begun with Hengist and Horsa ended with William and his Norman knights, the circle closing as Germanic traditions gave way once more to influences from across the Channel. But the foundations laid during 6 centuries of Anglo-Saxon rule, legal traditions, administrative practices, cultural patterns, and social structures, would survive conquest to influence the development of what would eventually become one of Europe's most powerful kingdoms.